Hello and welcome to RIVE, Reflections in Veterinary Education. We have a journal club this month and Eric is going to be leading it. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Eric.
Cool, thanks. So we are reading a comparison of machine-graded (parentheses ChatGPT) and human-graded essay scores in veterinary admissions by Vanderstichel and Stryhn in JVME. This was 2025. This is still in digital, so it's not in print yet. So
It is if you
I
print it
chose
out.
this. What's that?
I said it is
Yeah,
if
you
you
can print
print
it
it out
out.
like I did. I'm terrible.
I chose this article because I am interested in AI applications, and we'll talk a little bit about our AI experience in a second. And it's relatively recent, and it's looking at veterinary admissions, which I'm always very interested in. So that's how I came to it. So let me start with the introduction, and then we'll kind of pause, and I'll check in with you guys. So obviously, admissions criteria, ideally we're trying to identify students who will be successful. And we've used cognitive measures such as test scores and GPA, but recently has been shifting to non-cognitive abilities, which are quantified with, for example, interviews or MMI, multiple mini interviews, or something like the Casper test, the situational judgment test, et cetera. And then in addition to that, a lot of applications have a written component of them, like an essay, which are reviewed and then sometimes scored by the faculty who are on the admissions committee. So that scoring process is very time consuming, reading through all those letters and then providing a score. So they've looked into automated essay scoring systems in the past. There were some projects even, pre-2020. They say it was introduced as early as the 1960s. But in the past, it found that they didn't work particularly well. But with the advent of massive large language models, which actually large language models have also been used to evaluate essays for a long time. So I think that they've just gotten better and more accessible to the general public. So now we have the AI-based LLMs, which pass the Turing test and kind of seem like a human being when you're interacting with them. And so they allow lay people to access LLMs, which historically you needed more computing skills than the average person. So using these AI systems, could that be improvement on having faculty do the assessment? So let's pause, and I just want to ask you guys about what your experience and perspective is with AI, because I think that will bias your interpretation and assessment of this paper in general. So Bobby, do you want to start?
I don't know what you're talking about. I have no biases whatsoever. Um, so I like most of us, like unless you're developing AI, right? Like I'm not an expert in AI, because I'm not even sure people who are developing it are experts in it yet. Because it does feel a lot of this generative AI does feel really new. However, I have been impressed with generative AI's ability for these kinds of things, right? Like asking it to diagnose a patient, I'm like super skeptical of. And when I've seen things like that, I'm like, I don't really like that. But when I ask it to say, like, hey, can you give me some feedback on like human communication stuff? That's actually where I think it has done okay as far as generating something I want. Like, hey, write me a script if I was gonna, if I wanted to break some bad news to a client about X, Y, and Z. Like I've actually had it be pretty good, and it follows the rules, and it's like expressing empathy, and it's doing all the things that I would want it to do. So I understand where if you provide it some guardrails, how it could actually be, it has a potential use here. I always sort of worry about, like what are we missing if we're relying on it completely, of course. Now, my huge bias is probably from this paper more even than about the AI. It's just about the admissions process, and I agree that the admissions process is overly cumbersome that everybody is doing, and also way full of bias. I think that there's actually potential for the AI to be less biased potentially in something like this if the input we create isn't biased, right? Like if you create a rubric that is inherently biased, right? If it's systematically biased, then that's not going to help. But if we're really careful about creating a rubric that's thoughtful and tries to actively avoid some of the biases that we know are there, I think it has the potential to do a good job of eliminating that and saving time. So I'm like optimistic about it. I like the idea. We'll see if we're there yet, is I guess the question.
Cool. Catherine, what are your thoughts about AI?
So I have mixed feelings about AI. I recently decided to use ChatGPT to, for example, write some job descriptions because I felt like that was something that I didn't really need to waste my time doing. And if I had AI do it, then I could just go back and edit it. And I was pleasantly surprised, although it was interesting because they put it in completely different formats for every job description. So I thought that was odd.
Oh, that is
Um,
interesting.
yeah, so I think that there are definitely uses, and I'm open to using them for specific things. My concern is that so I use this story to illustrate this because probably in 2020, a few of my girlfriends and I, who are all Asian American women, were considering writing a book. And we were trying to kind of get some just baseline data about sort of the population of Asian Americans in the United States. And so I went into Google and I was like, number of Asian veterinarians in the United States. And so at that time, we didn't have OpenAI, but obviously Google was using some type of AI algorithm. And it auto-corrected and said, looking for the number of avian veterinarians in the United States. And so I retyped it and said Asian American veterinarians in the United States, and it re-auto corrected me back to avian American or avian veterinarians in the United
That's
States.
so passive aggressive. Oh,
Yeah, and so that this is like 2020. This is 5 years
yeah.
ago, right? And since then I've done the same exercise and it doesn't do that to me anymore. But I guess my point is that yes, we're evolving, but as Bobby indicated, it depends on the inputs, right? It depends on the people who are creating it. And the vast majority of people who are creating it are older white men in the United States. And so while we might view this as something that could potentially reduce bias, there's an inherent bias in it. And there is an inherent way that they're going to program those systems to read things that are maybe going to miss those students who maybe don't write. And this is coming from a writing snob, right? Like I firmly believe that students don't write well and they need to learn how to write better. But we're going to miss some of those students who maybe don't have the writing skills, but still have the same content and concepts and heart, maybe grit, the things that we're really looking for in those non-cognitive skills. So yeah, I think that's my point of concern. Particularly as I was reading through this paper, and I know we'll get to this further, but there was a section in there that specifically said that and this is probably just a measure of bias, period, but that the human graded and the machine graded essays that were in the lower quartile were much more consistent than those that were in the upper quartiles. And that, that concerns me a little bit. I mean, it's great from the consistency perspective, but it's like, okay, but what is everybody missing in those lower quartiles? And why is it so different in the upper quartiles? So, yeah, I guess that's my sort of initial thoughts on it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the diversity piece because they put that in the introduction that one of the reasons why the profession has moved away from standardized testing is because of the bias which historically has sort of reinforced the very white veterinary profession. So the goal with holistic reviews was to try to improve diversity, but if those holistic tools themselves are biased, that's probably not going to be a goal that's achieved. So
Yeah, and
that's
they've
really
actually
interesting.
demonstrated. I mentioned to you all that I had read this article because I'm sort of figuring out our admissions process, and Casper has actually been proven to be incredibly biased. And so many of those schools that have been using Casper no longer use it for that reason.
Yeah.
So again, it's sort of garbage in, garbage out, and how do you determine that, and how do you really figure out if you're doing what you're trying to do with holistic admissions? There are advantages and disadvantages, which I'm sure we'll get into, but
Yeah.
Cool. Maybe we can
Eric, you
add
gonna tell us
those
about
Casper
your,
papers to the
oh
future.
yeah.
That would be neat. Yeah, my experience was highly skeptical. I'm generally a Luddite. Like, if given the choice, I am not down on new technology.
I have to say that
So
actually surprises me a little bit about you, Eric.
Yeah, I
yeah,
agree. And
yeah,
then I
like the
think about it, I'm like,
whole
maybe it shouldn't actually, but yeah.
yeah, the whole iPhone thing and like using my phone for stuff, and yeah, I'm just no. Um, and all the stuff on cars now, I'm like, no, don't tell me how to drive. Quit
I'm with
shifting
you.
the steering wheel when I get out of the lane.
Oh
Anyways,
I'm
yeah,
that
with
could
you
be a
on that
whole
for sure.
agreed.
full rant. Uh,
Yeah.
so I was pretty skeptical, and then I went to a conference, I don't know, a couple years ago, and they were talking about applications, and I went back to my office and played with it a little bit. I was like, oh, hey, yeah, okay, this might have some utility. Like you both pointed out, my experience is that it's very much garbage in, garbage out. And it's largely, except for what Bobby mentioned, garbage out. I find that it produces very generic responses that,
Yes.
regardless of the level of detail I provide it and the level of detail I ask for it, it won't actually give me very specific stuff.
Okay.
Um,
Okay.
so I think that, like you were saying, Catherine, like writing job descriptions, writing like letters of recommendation, like I'll put the like key characteristics of the student in, and then, it'll generate it and I'll go and tweak it and whatnot. Summarizing notes actually has been fantastic. That was probably the best use of AI is I give it my
Yeah.
PowerPoints and it generates written notes for conferences,
Yeah.
and I just go and clean it up. Oh my God, it saved me hours, hours and
Yeah.
hours. And then qualitative research, I think it also has some potential. I think to when you have a lot of data, trying to summarize that and then having it spot checked by a human. Obviously, there's flaws in that, and that could be a whole different discussion. But for getting what it does is it takes texts and organizes that text, right? Like that's
Exactly. Yeah.
fundamentally what these things are doing. So
I think you hit the nail
um,
on the head that summarizing is where like there's a lot of data that you want to summarize. Like that's where it's good. If you ask it to come up with something, that's where it's a little bit because that's really what it's doing in general, right? It's saying, hey,
right.
here's all of the knowledge that is available to me, right? To the human, whatever. And I'm going to try to summarize that to answer your question. And so that is why I think it becomes really generic because there's so much.
Yeah.
And so, but if you say, here's information, summarize this, that's where it excels. I agree.
I'm curious though, like, this is just running through my head of like all this technology and all the things that we, so John and I joke because, like, for example, my car, I like physically have to work really, really hard to close the trunk manually because it wants me to press a button instead.
Yeah.
And John and I joke, we're like, Wally, like we're moving into this world where we literally don't have to do anything for ourselves. And I'm like, but what is the point of that, right? Like, what is the point of saving ourselves so much time? If it's to get a little bit more work-life balance, I can kind of see that. But I think ultimately what happens is, oh, you can do this in half the time, so here's more work, right? I think that's what tends to happen more than, oh, you can do this in half the time, take that other half of the time to go do what it is you want to do. So you don't really get that work-life balance. So this is probably a philosophical discussion for another episode, but like, what are we doing with all the time that AI is supposedly saving us? And is it really doing anything for us to evolve and really become more, or is it just anyway,
Well,
I
I
just
think
had
that
that thought.
depends on the circumstance. I think
Right.
that very much depends on the circumstance because, like in my world, where if I need to see 50 emergencies today, right, and like I'm getting bogged down and getting bogged down, and if this can allow me to see, and normally I could see 25, at 50, like because that's the need. If I can see 50, so in the same amount of time I can see 50 cases, I'm doing a lot of good in that amount of time. And so I think of AI if it can do tasks that I'm not necessary for, like summarizing my medical record. That's something that needs to be done, but I don't personally need to do it because I've already input the things that I want. And
Right.
if it can save me time and allow me to treat twice as many patients in the same amount of time, that's great. I think it depends on what it is specifically that you're allowing us to do.
Sure.
I agree that's not going to be true in all circumstances, but when I think about it in my world, if we can be more efficient at seeing more cases, like I don't
Yeah.
have control over how many emergencies there are. And so, yeah, that's a benefit for me. And I'm not
No,
thinking
I
from a money,
sure.
that's the dangerous side, right?
Yeah. I agree. And I think getting back to the paper, it talks about like how it really did help streamline the process in many ways. But
Yeah.
then it didn't really, because they had to come up with a very specific rubric and they had to run it through several different iterations and they still had to compare it to the baseline. Like, so did it really save them time? Like, are they actually going to rely on that moving into the future? Because honestly, it's kind of like me having my technician write my notes and then I still have to go back and review them and I still have to make sure. And so even if you do have it summarized, you want to make sure that the things that you need in there to
Yeah.
be legally defensible are still there. And so yeah, I mean that's the whole thing,
Yeah.
right? And so yeah,
Yeah.
I guess getting it back to the paper though, that idea of like, well, it saved us this
Yeah.
and this and this, but in the end, really you didn't tell us how much time it took for you to do the rubric and how much time it took for you to
Yeah.
set up, the processes and make sure that you were putting it into the AI in the right way and like all of those things. So,
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think it is a philosophical argument. I mean, fundamentally, it's capitalism. It's so that we can funnel more money to the top 1%, right? That's what all of this is
Yeah.
about.
That's always what we're, that's my
So
goal in life. I don't know about y'all.
oh, of
yeah,
course,
yeah, that's
I
the
want to make
whole
the rich people
system.
as rich as they can be. Yeah.
Exactly.
Why
That's
not?
what we're here for. Okay, so the primary objective was to assess the reliability and gradient of essay scores as graded by both machines and humans. Secondary goals were providing recommendations for enhancing fairness and reliability of these scores and identifying measures that correlate with human and machine graded scores. So for methods, they had essays, the personal statement, as well as a essay about the concept of diversity from 2 years of student applicants. And the first year, they did sort of a general score for the essay and then a score for the diversity essay, and then scored the writing quality. The second year, they divided up those. So the VMCAS essay, they divided up into two separate items. And then for the diversity essay, they separated out into 4 items. They still had just one item for the writing quality. And then they individually, so the humans individually graded at least one applicant. And then there were many that were graded by 2 faculty. Then the machine grading process, I actually had to do some research with this. So they mentioned they used ChatGPT 3.5 Turbo with a maximum capacity of 4,097 tokens. A token apparently is a unit of data that the AI considers discrete and important. So it might be a word, it might be a piece of punctuation, it might be a phrase, it might be a part of a word. So that is used apparently in processing and billing for however many tokens you use up. That's what it kind of charges you apparently. So they gave some prompts, and they, in my opinion, didn't do a great job of writing out exactly what the prompts were. But it says something like outline the system role described as a thorough and fair grading assistant. With these rubrics, score the content of each personal statement. And there's a supplemental file, so maybe it's in that. I didn't have a chance to dig that out. And then some other stuff that I had to research was, at least at the time, ChatGPT had a temperature parameter, and the temperature parameter is basically how creative you want the AI system to be. So higher temperature gives more creative out of the box thinking, but also more nonsense. A lower temperature reading tries to make it as sort of strict as possible. And then, so they set it to 0, which is trying to make it as deterministic as possible. But nonetheless, they found some slight stochasticity, which basically means that you put the same data in and you get a slightly different result each time, which is, depending on your point of view, a bug or a feature of most AI systems. So then they looked at.
I think that's probably true of people too, though. Like having written multiple papers and a dissertation, like I wrote it and then I did the changes that they wanted me to do and then I submitted it and they're like, oh, but you need to do this. And I'm like, but you already, so I don't know that that's necessarily.
No, I think that's actually really a funny thing because I had the same thought, Catherine. I'm just like, Yeah, but I mean, I know I do the same thing, right? Like if you give me a case this week today, and then you gave me like the exact same case next week, I'm gonna probably do things a little bit
Right.
differently. Like let's be
Yeah.
honest. And so I don't know if that's an intentional feature, because again, if you have the temperature set to 0, in theory that shouldn't happen.
Right.
But like same thing with people, in theory I should be very reliable with myself, and yet
Right.
there's still going to be some deviation. So I'm like, is that a feature? Because it is by definition AI, we're trying to replicate the way people do things. Like
Yeah.
I don't know. So I think that might fall into the philosophical question too. But I wanted to ask a little bit more about this, and maybe you got some more information about it when you were researching it, Eric. But um, on the temperature, I just was sort of maybe struggling to understand, and maybe this is too much AI, like exactly what that means, uh, like creativity and like intentionally pulling nonsense, or I just maybe I'm just having a hard time wrapping my brain around a computer being creative. Like, how does that work from a programming standpoint? Like, you just sprinkle in some random arbitrary garbage, or is it like is there like some parameters where it's like, here's the information that is directly applicable to answering this question, and then here's the stuff that's kind of on the outskirts, and then here's the stuff that's even like tangentially related. You're allowed to use that in your answer or not? Like, is that how you understood it to mean?
So I don't actually know, but one way to conceptualize it is that as a consequence of my education, that is, I read a lot as a child, I often assume that the definition I know for a word is the correct one or best one.
Okay.
And then
Okay.
when I encountered other people in the world, I would use that word that way. And they're like, what are you talking about? I'm like, isn't that what that word means? And they're like,
Gotcha.
no. I'm like, I'm pretty sure it is. And so I would go to the dictionary, and yes, the word does mean that for the fourth definition down the line, right?
Gotcha.
That's not how most people use that word, Eric.
I
So
see.
that's kind of my analogy for it is
The
like
analogy.
you
Okay.
could take the most strict definition, the first one in Webster,
Okay.
as what the word means, or you can get the fourth one and start going out of left field.
I
I don't
see.
know if that's
Okay.
exactly right, but that's kind
No,
of how
but
I
I think
consider
that kind of tracks with how I had in my head, like how far outside of the bounds are you allowed to consider information, I think is how I'm thinking about it. And I think that's similar to what you're saying. So, okay, cool.
Okay, so the machine grading they did three different ways. They gave it the same set of five essays at a time. They did it in a rolling fashion where they replaced two of the essays for each sort of iteration, or they did a random where they randomize each essay in replicates. They do not in the methods say how many replicates they do, which really irritated me, but in the results, you can divine that there were three replicates. So, um, and then they used the API platform, which I had to look up this as well. It's basically a way of interacting with the data set from ChatGPT without the like human interface. So when you write it, it's basically like writing code,
Mm.
as opposed to putting in a text box like "tell me this." So purportedly, I assume that that minimizes the bias of like how it's interpreting the text, and it's giving it in a slightly clearer way. Then they calculated interclass correlation coefficients um, in a pretty
Can I
standardized
bring up a
way.
quibble here?
Sure.
So in their methods, when they talk about it's on page 375, comparing human and machine predicted scores, they have a sentence that really annoys me. Spearman's correlation coefficients were used to compare the agreement between the machine and human predicted scores. And I was like, no, they were used to compare the correlation between the scores, not the agreement. And so I was like really angry. So I was really angry when I read that, and I was like, Brah. So I don't know if anybody else was, but that's one of the things. And they're like, correlation coefficients assess the validity of final essay scores. And I was like, no, you assess the correlation of the scores. So that happened repeatedly, and I was a little bit frustrated that it happened, and then also it kind of got through. So I was a little bit disappointed in that piece. I think ultimately, like what they presented, but like just those words were not the right words.
Yeah, they definitely played fast and loose with the word validity,
Yeah.
which I
Okay.
find
That's
to
my
be a
quibble.
pretty
I can
common
let it go now.
problem.
And they didn't talk about reliability, and
No,
you have to have both for it to be
yep,
truly like
Hmm.
robust, right?
Yeah.
So anyway.
yeah. Um, okay, and then they compared human and machine predicted scores. In my, I don't want to read through all this because it's, I mean, it's not nonsense. Like it makes sense to me, but I think
Yeah.
it's just like mining the data for stuff that
Yeah.
is not particularly meaningful. And then, yeah, they claim validity of essays and admission, which obviously they didn't prove any validity.
Right.
Okay, so in the admission cycles, they had in the first one 778 applicants evaluated by 13 humans. 209 of those were rated by two raters, the rest were rated by a single one. And then in the next year, they had 8 people evaluate 552 applicants, et cetera.
So
You can sort of see the,
I was
yeah,
curious about that, why they had them. So it was like 29 and 33% or something were rated by two, and then the rest of them were rated by one. And then they're
yeah,
like, oh, and it's really important to note that was something like 8 out of overlapped over two. 5 of the 8 were, had, and I'm like, that was anybody else
yeah.
confused by that? It didn't seem to make any sense to me. It was almost like they were just trying to throw stuff in there to prove that they had done something right. And I was like, but this doesn't really prove anything. It just makes me ask more questions about why. Is it a time thing? Like there wasn't enough time for everybody to do, or we were trying to establish inter-rater reliability. And so they, the two that were rated, we looked at whether, anyway, it just seemed weird to me. Was I the only one who thought that was weird?
There was a lot of weird, because again, they're using historical data, right? So this is
Right.
just what happened in real life. And then I think they were trying to isolate individual raters, and 5 of the 8 raters that were included in this data set had rated in both years, and 3 of them were in only one year or the other, or something like that. And then, yeah, the percentage that just happened to have 2 of the, so what wasn't clear to me was that, is it in their normal admissions process some of these would only be rated by one person, or they were
Right.
saying no, we're only choosing the 8 raters that were included in this data set, which was kind of how I took it. But maybe
Yeah.
I missed something if that was clear somewhere else. But I took that we're going to take essays that were graded by these 8 raters for whatever reason, and then however that shook out. And it happened to be that a quarter of them or whatever, the 8 raters that they arbitrarily chose, had some overlap. That how you understood it, or
I'm
no?
I'm going to guess that one year they had 13 people volunteer to do admissions, and then next year they had 8. I would assume that they used all the
Oh,
data that
okay.
they had.
So they just used the 8 that were in both years.
That's no. So the first year they used, let's assume they have 13 people review. They used all the data that they had, which was from all 13 people. The next year they
Oh,
put out a call, hey, we need people to write essays. Everyone's like, nope, I'm too busy. I'm not going to do it. They had 8 people
yeah, fair.
volunteer to read them. That's how I interpret it,
Oh
but
yeah.
that's
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
generous.
But of the 8-person year, 5 of them were
Yeah,
also in the
five
year
of them
before.
overlapped. Yeah,
That's
so
okay.
five
Yeah, yeah,
five people are like, yeah, I'll do it every year.
yeah.
So
Uh,
I
Yeah.
don't
this is my
particularly.
interpretation, but it's not written
Got it.
that way.
I think you're
Yeah, and
right. I
so I
think you're
think
right.
that's the problem, right? When you write something, when you have 3 people who are pretty smart trying to figure it out and can't, that's a problem. The other thing is like I don't really know what value that adds to any of this, because to me it just made me ask more questions. Like, okay, so are you taking only the ones that overlapped and you're trying to say that there was consistency among them, which you're not? Were you trying to
Yeah.
take, I mean, why were you telling us that less than a third of these were rated by two and most of them were only rated by one? And what consistency
Yeah.
then can you really determine based on that? Because there's no way to reinforce that Eric graded this essay this way and Bobby graded this essay this way. And what happens if they're like really far apart? So then did they go, like, there was just so much there that I felt either wasn't relevant or just made me ask more questions. And so again, it was one of those things where I'm like, well, how did this get through review? Because
Yeah.
these are
It
all the
felt like a
questions that
day
I would
job.
have been asking if I was a reviewer. I do think that please don't get me wrong. I think this is really interesting and important, but
Yeah.
I just think it could have been cleaned up a little bit there. Because for me, it was
Yeah.
just like, why are they telling me this? This just confuses me. So
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks for pointing that out. So, yeah, and then indicate how many machine graded ones, etc. And then they looked at their inter-rater reliability human and inter-replicate reliabilities machine in table 1. So looking at table 1, they separated out into 2 years. So the first year, writing the diversity or the VMCAS standard, and then the specifically diversity one, the human ICCs were 0.2, 0.1, 0.3 or so, which are quite low. And then in the next year, those same ones were sort of 0.1 as high as 0.4 for one of them. So all the human ICCs are pretty low, which is not terribly surprising to me anyways. We can talk about that in a second.
Though, because if you look in their table, it says their N of 778 with 13 raters. Of these, 209 applicants had their essays rated by 2 raters. So how are they doing the inter-rater reliability if there wasn't more than one rater?
Yeah.
Which means their N should have been a very different N, right?
Yeah. It's very confusing.
Yeah. Oh, that's a good point. Yeah, they should have been 209. Yeah, they should have been 209.
But in the table it says 778. And so I'm like, what data were you assessing inter-rater reliability on essays where only one person read it? And then how do you do that?
Right, because there's no inter-rater there.
It's just, unless they rated it twice differently, but they didn't clarify that. So yeah, I got lost a little bit in the numbers. And I was like, am I missing something? But I was like, I'm pretty sure you said 778. And in the table it says 778. And it doesn't say anything about the overlap, because they did make that like pretty clear that not all of them were rated by 2 people, but then the numbers seem like they were run on all of them, which doesn't make sense.
Agreed.
Okay. I'm not crazy for being confused by that.
Nope.
Cool.
And then the machine ICC. Now, this is not the same as inter-rater. So they basically, for the same, for example, they gave it 5 essays, and then they gave it 5 essays again, and then they gave it 5 essays again. So
that part I followed, and those numbers worked for me.
Good.
It was just the human one that I was like, wait a minute.
So for the ones where they gave them the same ones, the ICCs were all very high, which you would expect because it's the same data going in, should be the same data going out. For those that did rolling, so they kind of changed out 2 for each. The ICCs are kind of in the 0.4 to 0.6 range, and those where they had random pairings, the ICCs were kind of 0.4 to 0.5 or 6. Really and then the relationship, which I agree with Bobby in that I actually don't know how to interpret the Spearmans, because the way that they wrote this sentence is not right. But assuming that they had a human assigned score for a thing and then a machine assigned score, and looked at the relationship between those two, that Spearman's was in the 0.3, maybe as high as 0.4 for one of them range. So relatively, not great correlation in my opinion.
I agree. I would consider that not very good. I don't like correlations. That's my bias. Correlation stats in general, because they're always like, oh yeah, if it's like 0.5, that's pretty good. I'm like, really? Not really. Like, taller people weigh more. Yeah, that was super helpful information. Thanks so much. I don't know.
I'm going to kind of skip the next paragraph because it's just looking at comparing the absolute values. But going on to figure 2, where the box block of the distribution that Catherine alluded to, where they look at, okay, so the humans place this person in the bottom quartile, the top quartile, or one of the 2 quartiles in between. Where did the machine place that person's essay? And as she mentioned, the bottom quartile was consistently lower, ranked bottom for both the machines and the humans. So we can pause there. I did want to bring in to the discussion, we did a study where we looked at intern applications, personal statements, and had a number of evaluators read them. And we had something similar where the bottom quartile, our coefficient of variation was narrower. So we tended to agree more on those that had a poorer scored letter than those that had a better scored letter. But yeah, so the data from this, that the machines and the people agree on the bottom quartile. Catherine, you were having some thoughts about that.
I'm just curious about that because it's interesting to me that we can recognize pretty consistently
What we don't like.
what we consider poor performers, but we are very inconsistent in recognizing good and outstanding performers. And you would think that it might be the other way around, but
Yeah.
I guess, yeah, I guess I would need to think about that more because I just
Yeah.
find that interesting. I don't
Yeah.
psychologically understand why that would be the case. And I
Right.
don't,
It feels like there's two possibilities, right?
yeah,
Either, right? The more generous explanation is that nope, they're consistently poor and we're good at recognizing who's poor. Like that's possible. Like these are just not as good a candidates and we're all agreement like, yeah, they're just not performing well for whatever reason. That's one. Or the possibility is, again, our rubrics are biased in a
mhm,
consistent way. We don't know what we don't know, and so what we think is poor, and what we've taught the machines to think is poor, and what we've taught other people, each other over the time, are like, oh yeah, that's a marker of bad, whether it is or not.
right.
We all agree what bad looks like, and I think that's the major question, though, Catherine, that you were saying. Is that all because we've been trained in the same, biased system, that the system is stacked against certain traits, or certain features, or, I mean, I can understand, right? I'm picturing an example like, oh, the grammar is atrocious, right? Or
Right.
there's a lot of
Sure.
spelling errors or things like that. Those are things that I think we would all be like, either like the knowledge isn't up to snuff, or they didn't put enough time and effort into proofreading, or what was it. But you could also imagine, like, well, English is their second language and they're a first generation grad, and they don't have somebody to proofread this for them. And, you can come
Or
up with a more generous.
they didn't use ChatGPT to write their essay, right?
Exactly.
Like,
And so
so
you can theoretically come up with an example where it was a biased rubric, right? Like that. And is that really what we care the most about? And yet, I think we could all be like, oh, yeah, we agree that was a crummy letter because it was, the grammar was not good, or, other things. And so I can imagine both scenarios being true. What I think is really fascinating is that in the upper quartile, that's
right.
where, like, what I think is really good and what you think is really good, sometimes we agree and sometimes we don't. And I think that's really fascinating.
That's what I think is really interesting too. And I agree with everything that you said, Bobby. But that to me, from a psychological perspective and a sociological perspective, is the most interesting thing. It's like the fact that you, me, and Eric could all grade papers, let's say 100 papers, and maybe our bottom 25% would all be pretty consistent, but our top 25% would probably be very different. And I find that
Yeah.
fascinating. And there's lots of implications for that, particularly when you're talking about things like selecting interns and selecting
Yeah.
residents and selecting
Yep.
people who you think are going to be a good fit and who are not going to be a good like. And so again,
Yep.
that's another philosophical conversation, but that's just really interesting to me. So I don't know, Eric, what you think, but
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a consistent finding. And my experience is, sometimes people, like I've sat in these meetings where we're looking at these letters of application and someone's like, this is fantastic. Like it was so unique and they used a different writing voice and this kind of stuff. I'm like, no, it's
You're like,
fluff. It's all fancy, frivolous
yep.
nonsense. Don't
That's
give me a
exactly the
poem
example that
as a
came to my
letter
head.
of intent. Yeah,
You're like,
yeah,
I don't want it to start with it was a dark and stormy night. That's weird,
right,
right? Where somebody
right,
else is
right,
like,
I
are you
was
right.
supposed
born
to
at a very
create a
young
writing
age.
competition? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. As soon as you start
Um,
telling me about the time you saved a kitten when you were a kid, and that's what I was like,
right,
"Bleh." It doesn't
right.
matter
Yeah.
if that's
Yeah.
true. I don't want to hear about it.
So
Yeah.
are we more biased against exceptional and those people who are
I
trying to stand
don't know.
out than we
I
are
think that
against
I
we're
think,
people who
probably
aren't?
just I think that
I,
what we want diverges so much.
yeah.
Sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because I think
Yeah.
especially in writing, because somebody's personality is coming through in the writing, and
Yeah.
like I think about the people I want to hang out with and the people you guys want to hang out with are probably not always this. There's going to be some overlap, right? There's going to
Yeah.
be a Venn diagram. There's
Yeah.
going to be some people that we all agree with, and there's going to be some people that I love spending time with, and you guys are like, why do you like that person? Right? And that's
Yeah.
okay. But when we're trying to make these decisions that have real impacts for people, for us too, right?
Yeah.
Because I've been in those same meetings, Eric, where like we're all sitting around a table and we're trying to pick the residents, and somebody's like, "Oh, this one was my favorite," and I was like, "That one's your favorite?" And they're double. Can we get a photo up, because I don't think we're talking about the same person.
Yeah.
But yes, we are much more likely to agree on the, yeah, no, we don't like this one. Yeah, we don't like this one. And it is really fascinating.
Yeah.
I don't know what it
Yeah,
means.
I think the issue of rubrics also is worthwhile, and I've actually put that as a topic for a future show because we can really get into
Yeah.
that. But I did dig up the supplemental file about their prompt,
Oh, cool.
and I'm not really impressed with their description of it.
Uh-oh.
Partly because they censor the rubric. So, for example, for writing, you get 10 points, 2 out of 10 equals poor, poorly written, organized essay with dot, dot, dot. And so then I look down at the ellipses and it says ellipses indicate censored portions of the rubric to maintain confidentiality. So what I interpret that is to mean that they just didn't tell us what rubrics they used in this paper because it's proprietary to the institution. I don't know. I don't understand why I can't see the rubric. So
Oh,
that makes it really hard for me to interpret any of this data, frankly, because I don't know what the rubric is that they were scoring with.
Yeah.
interesting.
I
Yeah.
always feel like that's like a little bit of a cop out. Oh, it's proprietary information or it's like, okay, that's
Nobody
fine, but what
wants
are
your
you trying
rubric.
to hide? You know, like
Yeah.
what wool are you
Nobody
pulling
wants your
over our
rubric.
eyes? You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah,
like
you're not
Everyone thinks their
selling it.
rubric is better and they're going to make their own. So,
yeah,
That's
yeah.
yeah.
fine. If you think your rubric is that great, like, are you selling it? Like, what are you
I
doing with
right.
it?
Yeah.
That's so weird. Yeah, and the dot 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 is like that's I mean, I use those. I'm such a millennial in that
Yeah,
regard.
me too. I'm
But
not a
it's just like,
millennial, but yeah.
ooh, this suspense. No, I'm not either, but I am in that regard. It cracks me up. Anyway, yeah, that is frustrating, Eric, because
Yeah.
it is really hard to interpret any of this and like the validity of any of it, right? If there's no face validity, if I can't see the rubric,
Yeah.
then
Yeah.
okay. All right, fun.
Okay. And then they look at some marginal estimates for people and machine. And this I thought was pretty interesting that the human score variance was about 2.5 times larger than the machine variance. So the machine scores is 2 to 3 times greater precision than human scores. And what this immediately made me think of is if you ask people to write out what their prediction of say flipping a coin is 10 times or 20 times in a row, they will very 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 rarely give a string of heads 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 heads, right?
Yeah.
Because we think in a fair coin system it should go back and forth here and there, right? But that's not how statistical systems work. And so when I look at this data I'm like, oh, these are humans trying to create variability in their score to replicate a a bell-shaped curve.
Yeah. Mm.
Oh, that's
That's how
interesting.
I
Okay.
saw
Yeah.
that data.
I hadn't thought of it that way, but I think you could, yeah, that's interesting.
That's
This is Inception. Now the humans are trying to mimic the computers.
Right. Yeah,
which
yeah,
is
yeah.
probably
Because
very
you're
true.
like, oh, I got to give some people a low score. I got to give some people a high score, right? Like I just got to.
Interesting.
I
Yeah.
think that's probably very true. I've had these conversations. So when I was teaching public health, we had a new dean ascend to the leadership role, and the dean was very insistent that if you were grading your students in such a way that you were not getting a bell curve, then you were doing something wrong. And so I sat down and had this conversation, and I'm like, dude, that's actually completely counterintuitive to everything that we're supposed to be doing in education, right? Like, and I wasn't as eloquent until I met Ken Royal, who was like, oh yeah, when I have people tell me that, I just look at them and I'm like, this is an experiment, right? Like education is a treatment group. So if you have a group of people that you don't teach, you would expect them to have a bell curve. But if you have a bunch of people that you teach, that's like fertilizing plants. And so you would assume that your bell curve is going to skew appropriately. And so, no, you should not, especially in graduate and professional
Should not
school,
have a
you
bell
should
curve.
not expect a bell curve because if you have a
Yeah.
bell
That's
curve,
for
then you've
random
done
chance.
something wrong, right? You've either
Yeah.
admitted the wrong students or you're teaching the wrong
Yeah.
way or you're
It's just
grading the
random
wrong
chance.
way or
Yeah.
whatever. But you're right, Eric. I think we do, as a
Mhm.
as a sociocultural thing, assume that there's always going to be
Normally
this bell
distributed
curve of
data.
people when you have a big
Yeah.
enough population. So yeah, I think that's interesting. I think that's probably accurate.
Well, and you know what? In all the different like types of biases that get studied, that probably is one of them that has a name, right? There's
Yeah,
probably one of those
probably.
where you're just like, hey, I've given too many A's. I have to start
Yep.
giving some B's and C's, right? Like, it might not even be a bell curve, but there's probably some inherent bias that we have. And I feel that like I was reviewing proposals for an education conference here a little bit ago, and and I do this when I grade my exams. Like you just keep getting a bunch of like, oh, this one's really good. Oh, this one's really good. Oh, this one's really, you're like, oh, am I doing something wrong? Because I just
Yeah.
keep giving the same score. And then you get one that's crummy and you're like, oh, thank goodness it's not me. Like, you know, or I've done that when I've graded exams and you're like, oh, they're all getting it right or they're all getting it wrong. You're like, this must be a bad question. And then, but they get strung together where you get 3 or 4 at the beginning and you're like, that's not how the coin is supposed to be flipped. And so you
Right.
think there's something wrong until you get more data to be like, okay, that just was random chance. But you do have that. I do. I know I've had that like questioning. I mean, I keep going, but I'm questioning it. I'm like, is this really the right result? What's wrong here? Because
Yeah.
this is not. And but you're right, Catherine. Like if I'm reading proposals for people who've submitted, like these are probably people who put some time and effort into it, and it's totally fine if they all get a high score, and that is often what happens. But I have that like feeling in my gut. I'm like something's not right. So
Yeah.
you're probably both totally right that that is influencing some of these scores. We're
Yeah.
trying to be more like computers. What's wrong with
I
us?
know. Well, the other interesting thing too is, this whole idea of like, um, I think the language that surrounds it, like we're talking about, we're giving grades, we're doing this, but really, like I was very intentional later in my career of like saying, no, I didn't give students any grades. Students
There you go.
earned the grades based on what they were required to do within the course. Because I always joked, students always earned an A, but got an F. And I'm like, no, whatever grade you earn is the grade you earn. I'm not giving you a grade, you're earning the grade. So
Yeah.
I think it's also sort of involved with language and things like that. But again, I'm very well aware of that. And I still find myself doing the same thing. I find
Yeah.
myself doing that on if I'm taking an exam, I'm like, I've
Yeah.
answered B 4 times in a row. Is that like,
Yeah.
right? Like,
Exactly.
like there have been times when I'm like, I really want to write an exam and all of the answer is B or all the
Yeah.
answer is, 3
And
just to
but
see.
that's a psychological exam at that
Yeah,
point,
but then it's
right?
psychological, but that's what we do. We second guess, like, do I
Yeah.
really know the material or am I just freaked out because I've answered B 4 times in a row and that can't possibly be right?
Now the question really though is, Catherine, do you change your answer? Are you aware of it and go, no, I'm okay. Like this, because that's again, I'm like reading it, and I'm like, this feels weird, but just keep going with it. Just trust
Yeah.
the process, you know? But so having an awareness of it is actually probably pretty good, right? Like that
Yeah.
at least we're noticing that we're doing
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
True.
Maybe.
Like most biases, awareness is the first step.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
That's cool.
Okay, and then they go and relate it to other admissions criteria such as GPA, MMI score, Casper score, etc. So, looking at the machine correlations, they are consistently higher. That is, the score, if the machine gave a high score to an essay, that student also tended to have a high GPA. If they had a high score on the essay, that student also tended to have a high Casper, et cetera. So the machine consistently had a higher correlation than the human assigned scores. It's not by a lot. It's numerically pretty low. The correlations are all less than a 0.2 anyways. So 80% of what is predicting, the students' GPA is
Annie.
not captured with the essays here. But it is consistently higher than the human correlations, which are often atrocious. Like the GPA correlations are terrible. Now, again, that might be a feature, right? That might be the point of
Exactly.
the exercise is to give a data set that is divergent from
Yeah.
the quantitative data like their GPA.
That's what
So
this was the most interesting part of this article for me. Was like, do you want it to correlate with this stuff? I thought that was kind of the point, is that and so maybe the humans were better at picking up on just some little nugget that was not immediately obvious and that was kind of a little intangible almost. They were like, oh, there's just something I like. Now, is there a bias in that? Totally. But isn't that kind of the point of looking outside of all of these rubrics is we're trying to find a different kind of bias, I guess. I don't even know how to describe it. But I actually was like, huh, so the computer isn't giving us more useful information, right? We should just, skip all this, stop making people write essays and just give me your GPA and call it good. But the humans were maybe able to tease out something that the computers and your grade point average could it? So I thought that was kind of the most fascinating part of the article.
I also think it's really interesting, and I've read a lot of admissions articles, and I find it so interesting that they're always trying to correlate these non-cognitive skills and aspects to the
Well, like
cognitive
what?
things, because like Bobby says, like, isn't the whole point to measure different strengths of different people, right? And so there's all these things about, oh, well, the non-cognitive things actually correlated with the first quartile and this and that, or they didn't correlate or this, and I'm like, what you really want to know, and they do sort of mention this in their discussion, is like, do these non-cognitive skills correlate with their clinical,
Yeah.
right? Their clinical experiences, their clinical performance, and then beyond in when they go into practice. And that's what we're missing data on, is like
Yeah.
these holistic admissions processes are great. We have lots and lots of data about whether or not, the students who are selected under holistic admissions are successful in school and what quartile they fall in. What we don't have is how successful were they isolated maybe in that clinical area and then beyond into practice. I mean,
Yeah.
with my whopping N of one, and that being me, I know that if you looked at my cognitive scores during vet school versus my non-cognitive, and then that correlation to my skill in clinical, it's like I was a completely different student, because I was at best average. I was a 2.9, 3.0 student in the preclinical years, and I was a 3.8 student in the clinical years, because there's just a different skill set involved with what's going on there. And so, yeah, I'm confused by this constant, like, we do holistic admissions and we want to measure the non-cognitive and the cognitive skills, but we still really want to know if the cognitive skills and the non-cognitive skills relate to each other,
Yeah. Like, I don't know. And I don't know if
Yeah.
that's what they were looking for, if that's just to appease like the skeptics, but it seems
No.
like, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so they, go through the discussion, which largely we've kind of talked about a lot of this. They did mention, kind of already talked about this, that the one of the limitations is that the output is variable when you put the text in, even if you set the temperature to 0. They did mention that giving instructions to the AI to take the time to think about it is interesting.
I thought that
um,
was interesting too.
yeah, and so like formal ways to do that. They talk about the problem with prompt engineering, and the way you write the prompt is really important, and then especially in this case, the way the rubrics are written are really important. Um, and yeah, I think everything else we've kind of touched on.
Yeah.
So, Bobby, what's your takeaway from this paper?
Oh, you guys are gonna love this. Stop doing the admissions the way we do it and let's go to a lottery. Whoop.
Yep, random lottery.
Yep.
I
I think I've said this
I
on this
can't
podcast
agree
before,
more.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I can't agree more. Catherine, what about for you?
Um, I think it's sort of, I sort of agree with random lottery, not really. I think there's still a minimal sort of threshold that we would need to
Yeah.
select and then just
Yeah.
pull from
From
that,
there.
like what we
No,
consider.
yeah,
Yeah,
there's a
yeah, yeah.
minimum threshold, not like a
Yeah.
lottery for the
Yep.
population at large, but and
Um,
maybe even raise the standard if you want
yeah,
to, like if you really want to. But ultimately, once you're qualified, I say lottery.
yeah. But I guess it just goes back to my whole question, and I apologize. My cat, I have a calico who's getting very feisty because she's
A
enclosed
calico.
in a small space and has been stressed out. So,
Oh,
yeah, I think it goes back to that whole idea of like, well, that this is great, but it didn't really do anything in terms of saying this is a valid and reliable way to do it. And it actually didn't quantify the thing that it said it wanted to quantify, which is, does it save the hours that they really purport that it saves? Because in the end, it sounds to me like there was a lot of work that had to go into it to get it done. Now, maybe it would save hours after that initial work had been done. I don't know. Maybe that's something that they could report on as a follow-up, but I don't feel like, maybe it saved some hours for the faculty themselves who were going through the review, but I don't know that it saved time generally for everyone. So I think it's an interesting concept. I think it's important. I think we need to explore it more. I'm not ready to tell my admissions committee to go ahead and just use generative, AI to to do some machine grading. But I have questioned the use of essays and the use of letters of recommendation for a long time because I mean, that's a whole nother conversation too, but right, like how do we know that they're not using generative AI? How do we know that they're, I mean, I sat on an admissions
They
committee
are.
for
They
several
totally
years
are.
and it was pretty clear to me when somebody had not written their own essay, but it's becoming harder and harder to determine that. And frankly, I don't know that it really does much for us as admissions committees, right? I think if anything else, this tells us it doesn't really do that much for us. So, yeah, much longer way of saying what Bobby said.
It does remind me, I've encountered a
Annie.
prompt framework that I really like. It's called Script, which is situation, describe the specific situation, problem, or scenario, context, provide relevant context, background information, constraints, role, assign a particular role, persona, or perspective for the AI to take on, instructions, give clear instructions on the task, persona, define the personality traits, tone, style, or manner the AI should exhibit, target, specify who the intended target audience is. And so when I've generated prompts, the more information that I can give it, the better, especially that role piece, I think is
Yeah,
interesting
that's
that,
interesting.
a lot of the times you don't think like you are a, new faculty member, you are a clinical
Yeah,
faculty member with
yeah,
minimal training in pedagogy, evaluating a letter, etc. Like really
yeah.
like spell it out. Like, what is this supposed to be replicating?
Yeah.
Mhm.
It'll be interesting, looking at it in that way.
Fascinating.
Yeah, I mean,
Uh,
yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens, but I would be curious if AI would be able to grade something and determine whether or not it was written by AI, right?
Yeah,
Like that might
yeah.
be really
yeah,
useful.
That would be cool. Yeah. I think
yeah,
it was really great that they did this study. I think this is
Yes,
coming down. People have a lot of questions, and I think this is a really good start. And so, yes,
absolutely.
yep.
there were some flaws, and we picked on them a little bit, but ultimately, like there was a lot of good stuff in this. And overall, I think it was, well designed. Again, nothing's ever perfect, but so I really appreciate that they did this, and they're trying to answer these questions. And yeah, I mean, it's like not a clear answer one way or the other, but at least here's some information so people can make a slightly more informed decision about whether or not this is something they want to explore. So I think in that regard, it's super helpful to have.
Yeah, absolutely. And I
Cool.
think it's important to reiterate that all the time, right? Like I would tell my students when we're reading through studies and they're like, oh, this study is terrible. It's this and that, and it has this flaw. And I'm like, listen, it's really easy to pick something apart after it's been done. But it got through review, it's published. Doesn't necessarily mean it's great or that it's even good, but it means that it was worthwhile enough to contribute. And so, and I'm not saying that about this paper. I think there was a lot of good information in it, but I just want to reiterate that, yeah, we pick at it and it's easy to pull things apart. But in the end,
Journal clubbing is
it,
about.
it, it made a meaningful contribution to the literature. And that's really ultimately the
Absolutely.
important part.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool.
Cool.
Thanks for
Great.
picking it, Eric.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks.